resume.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Good morning, Mr. Memerick.
Good morning.
We left off yesterday, and we had been discussing the workshop that you facilitated at the end of November of last year, the two-day workshop, where you met with all of the scientists who prepare technical reports for this commission. And I want to take you to the end of that workshop, because essentially I think there was a breakout session that we discussed yesterday at which you examined the alternative hypotheses that had emerged originally from the PSC workshop in June of 2010. And then, as I understand it, you revisited those alternative hypotheses in the workshop that you facilitated in November of 2010. Is that right?
That's correct. We had a brief session where we broke into, I think, 4 subgroups, and each of those subgroups randomly constituted, looked at the conclusions from the PSC report and then reevaluated them in light of what they had just heard on the preliminary findings at the workshop.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lund, could we please pull up PDF 361 of Exhibit 1896? The first thing I want to do is confirm the list of participants, and I see that they are there, and you can confirm that for us, can you?
That's correct.
And then if we go back to, I think it's PDF 35. Just bear with me a moment. Oh, 367, thank you.
357 maybe?
367. Oh, sorry.
Must be
Must be 357.
Thanks.
There's no PDF 367. Thank you. So in these notes, there's the integrated workshop tasks, and that's the breakout session that you just described. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then after the breakout session, people reassembled, I gather, and going to the next page under discussion, there was an ability then for a free-ranging discussion on some of the alternative hypotheses and what had changed, more or less, in people's minds, particularly people who may have participated in the PSC workshop in June, and then what it basically had started to reassemble in their minds as a result of hearing from the scientists who presented it at the workshop that you facilitated in November of 2010. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, that's correct. I think there was only maybe, I'd have to check, but maybe 5 or 6 people who had been at both workshops.
Yes, I think Dr. Peterman, for example, was at both workshops and was a primary motivator of the PSC workshop in June of 2010. Is that not correct?
Well, he wasn't a motivator of it. He was asked to lead it by the Pacific Salmon Commission.
Right. So if I can then take you to some of the discussion, and Mr. Commissioner, I'm not going to go through this, but I commend this discussion to you because it's rather informative in terms of the free-ranging discussion that ensues when scientists are allowed to speak their minds freely. If I could take you to the last 360, PDF 360. Right before closing comments, right at the top of the page, there it is. Dr. Peterman says, we're lacking the big picture because we're not thinking big enough. The proposal for a fully integrated Strait of Georgia study is not thinking big enough. Everyone is studying small pieces. And then Dr. Skip McKinnell says, I think there's an opportunity. And then there's some discussion with Dr. Levy. And then Dr. McKinnell says, even something like the old Fisheries Research Board model, look at what is failing and where advances could be made in a way that is cost effective and that provides new insights. And I think I want to come back into the discussion that we left off yesterday which was trying to figure out a mechanism for moving forward in terms of how are we going to address the science that needs to be done in an efficient, cost-effective manner. And one of the proposals I've been advancing is something like the old Fisheries Research Board model that's quasi-independent of government, but has some reign to sort of, free reign to sort of focus in upon research questions. I see you're nodding your head, so am I striking a responsive chord there?
Yes, I guess head nodding doesn't get down in the transcript. So I think that's an interesting proposal, and one other model that might be examined is that of the International Joint Commission for the Great Lakes,
Yes.
where they drew scientists from different relevant entities, Environmental Protection Agency, Ministry of Environment, but when they went into the International Joint Commission, they were forced to sign something. They were taking off their institutional hats. They were just there as independent scientists. That having been said, I think it's also important that a group like that focus their efforts on questions that are really important to people making management decisions. You know, it doesn't become just a theoretical academic exercise.
I now want to not necessarily shift topics, but what I'm struggling with is a framework for decision making. Given that there seems to be a lack of scientific certainty around what essentially is causing the decline. I mean, we can point to certain factors and say, well, this hypothesis is likely or this hypothesis is less likely. But basically, are we not in an era where we have scientific uncertainty about what has caused the decline in the Fraser River sockeye?
Certainly that's true, and there are methods for making decisions under uncertainty which are wholly relevant to the situation.
Right, and that leads me to discussing with you the precautionary principle and the precautionary approach. And just so that we're clear on what the precautionary principle is, I'm going to read you the Principle 15 from the Rio Declaration and make sure you agree with it. I just want to make sure that we're speaking about the same thing. So that principle says, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to protect environmental degradation. That's the principle that I usually cite. Is that the one that you use as well, or do you use something other than that?
Well, interestingly enough, I checked on this morning and passed on to Ms. Baker, who passed on to Mr. Lunn, a paper that Randall Peterman had given at a salmon summit, I think it was 2008, organized by Simon Fraser University, where he talks about the precautionary principle applied to fisheries and the precautionary approach. So actually, I don't know if I could put that up very quickly, just to show you
Well,
the way I would think about it.
since you mentioned it, I think that we're obliged to see it.
Okay, it'll just take a moment.
I do have a paper copy of this that he gave us this morning, so I'll just circulate that around.
Because I do think it's important to understand terms. I think precautionary principle has been applied differently in different contexts, and so we're talking apples to apples.
So what you appear to have handed out to everyone is Chapter 23, entitled An Overview of the Precautionary Approach in Fisheries and Some Suggested Extensions by Dr. Randall Peterman from Simon Fraser University.
Yes, and the simplest summary of this is if you go down, I think it's page 2, the first figure, I'm not sure, at the bottom.
Page 234 of the extract.
Yeah, if you could expand that figure, Mr. Lund, there. So he described the two things there as, and I don't know if this is the same as your definitions, sir, but essentially the restrictions imposed on human activities. So severe restrictions, what he would refer to as applying the precautionary principle, would involve a ban on something. So no longer dumping of waste in oceans, whereas a precautionary approach is that you would allow the activity to continue but use safety margins relevant to that activity. So that's just...
Right. Those safety margins would in effect correspond to limit reference points, for example, in harvesting or establishing benchmarks for conservation units. Something
Exactly.
of that nature.
Yeah. So that was my understanding. So just, I don't know if it's exactly the same as the quote you had from the Rio. A little bit further above is it Randall Peterman's definition of the principle. on this page, but anyway, that's, so it sounds similar, but I think the implications here is that if you apply the principle the way he's presented it, then activity doesn't happen at all. Whereas with the approach, an activity may happen.
Right, so as long as we're not talking semantical differences, I understand that there's probably a spectrum at which you examine cost-effective measures, and if it looks as though something's really going to be disastrous for the environment, you may want to invoke the principle, as Dr. Randall Peterman says here.
That's fine.
But in other approaches, you're going to take, or other situations, you're going to adopt an approach as opposed to a principle.
That's correct.
Okay. So, and the fishery is a really good example of that in terms of we have a resource that's being utilized by many users, Aboriginal users, indigenous peoples have used this for centuries. We have commercial fishing sectors, we've got sport fishing sectors, so everyone is dependent upon that resource, more or less, are they not?
Yes.
And so in the context then where you put conservation of the resource as a primary objective, which we've done through the wild salmon policy, you start off with the concept that you take measures to protect that resource, to protect the salmon. Do you not?
So this is where it gets interesting because there are trade-offs between different objectives. So for example, if you want to preserve excuse me, the Cultus Lake sockeye run and have a very high probability of doing that, you would need to curtail harvest by a substantial margin. And some of Dr. Peterman's students have done that sort of analysis. So it becomes a societal policy question with respect to what level of certainty you want to have at protecting that species at risk versus what level of harvest you would like to have, because obviously if you eliminated harvest, that would have some economic impacts. So I think there's a science aspect to this of evaluating those risks. And then there's a policy aspect of those, which is making the trade-offs between, for example, complete application of the wild salmon policy versus satisfying other societal, social, and economic needs.
Right. From a scientific perspective, though, it comes down to, as a scientist, basically, if you agree with the concept of biodiversity, and biodiversity is to be preserved, when scientists weigh in on that question, they often weigh in on it by saying, well, biodiversity is an important factor, and we should do what we can in order to preserve it. As a conservationist biologist, would you agree with that?
Well, I think the statement you just made is interesting. I think it was a fairly policy weighted statement. I mean, I think a lot of scientists who work on environmental things would like to see biodiversity preserved, okay? So as a scientist, I think your job is to, in a completely neutral way, say, if you would like to preserve biodiversity, if society would like to do this, here is what you would need to do.
Yes.
Okay?
And
then, you know, and then it becomes a policy decision of, well, yes, we would like to preserve biodiversity, but we also want to preserve these other social and economic goals, and politically we're willing to make some trade-offs. So for example, when Saginaw Lake sockeye were petitioned for being listed under the Species at Risk Act, the decision was made not to list them because the implications of doing so would have effect on the fishery. Okay, so that was a societal decision between competing objectives, basically.
And then move it into another arena where we also seem to have scientific uncertainty, and that's in the arena of fish farming and aquaculture, whether aquaculture is or is not affecting the Fraser River sockeye return. And firstly, would you agree with me that we do have scientific uncertainty in that field?
Yes, I would agree with you.
And so then, if we're to apply a precautionary approach as opposed to a principle where we're not necessarily going to shut down all the salmon farms everywhere along the coast, wouldn't it make some sense as a precautionary approach to limit the farms that are actually capable of impacting the Fraser River sockeye salmon on their migratory pathway?
In principle, I think managing those farms to limit impacts is a reasonable principle. The question then becomes, the devil's in the details. So how many farms do you allow, in which locations, to which degree, and what are those risks? And so because there is substantial uncertainty, and we have two reports which came to somewhat very different conclusions on disease, if you were to try to estimate what that risk is, as a scientist, my response would be, well, we need some data, as I said yesterday, on disease in order to make an intelligent estimate of that risk. Okay, then once you establish that risk and you say, well, if you have, I'll just make up a number up, 20 fish farms in this particular region, there's a high likelihood of disease getting transferred, and if you have 3, there's an extremely low likelihood, you know, just to make some numbers up. Then it gives you some ability to make some decisions. In the absence of that information, I think it's very difficult for people trying to do these risk assessments to make those decisions. How are they going to evaluate those risks quantitatively?
But if I come back to the precautionary approach as opposed to the principle, if we acknowledge that there is scientific uncertainty, and I fully accept that we need more science to be able to answer some of the questions that you're postulating there. But in the absence of that scientific knowledge, then we should be adopting a precautious approach with respect to the location of the fish farms along the migratory pathway, the Fraser River sockeye. Should we not?
I think the basic question here is, when you say apply a precautionary approach, how do you apply that in the absence of accurate information on risk? So to just flip back for a moment to a harvest situation, if you said, what limit reference points shall we set for this fish population about which we have absolutely no knowledge of its abundance or productivity? And the answer would be, we have no idea. And so fishery biologists would go out and say, well, let's get some basic information in order to understand something about this population, so that we can make set those cutoffs. Okay, so if you think about it, you know, the maximum allowable number of fish farms, or the type of farms, or the amount of activity or something, is like a limit reference point. And so you need some basic information that allows you to assess those risks. And I think that's where I would come down on it, because right now we have disease information within the fish farms, and that tells us something. But we don't have disease information within the sockeye, so we don't actually know how much exposure there's been.
If I can come back to that example you gave of limit reference points, and I fully accept that if you're in a fishery situation and you don't know what constitutes a lower reference point, you should better find out very quickly. But supposing you're in a situation where you don't know that, does it make sense to allow fishermen to simply go out and catch as many fish as possible? Does it make more sense to be precautious and exercise some constraint over that?
Yes, I think it would make sense to exercise some constraint over that. So I guess the question really is, what is the level of risk associated with different levels of fish farm activity? And I think that we've seen in the 2 reports from Noakes and Dill very different descriptions of that level of risk. So that doesn't provide a decision maker with a lot of guidance. You know, it's coming to a T-junction, being told to turn left or turn right, essentially. So I think in that kind of situation, I've encountered that before, where you have a very wide range of hypotheses about the level of impact. The best way to move forward and actually develop a tangible precautionary approach is to get the information and use it.
Right.
So that would, you know, it's consistent with what I said yesterday.
So we should be getting that information quickly, though.
Absolutely. And it should have been had quite some time ago.
Yes, I agree with that. Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Should we mark this document
Oh,
as
sorry.
exhibit?
Yes, we should mark that
Thank you.
extract from Dr. Peterman. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Thanks.
1906. Yes, Mr. Commissioner, it's and Mr. Marmarick, it's Chris Harvey from the West Coast Trollers Association and the UFAWU. Mr. Mr. Marmarick, you've been qualified as an expert in the area of adaptive management, and I think much of what you've been saying comes from that discipline. I must admit that I had to Google it last night to find out exactly what it meant. And what popped up immediately was something from the BC Forest Service website that defined it. And I'm guessing that maybe you had something to do with that definition that the Forest Service has adopted?
Well, there's many definitions. We have done work with the Forest Service on developing a curriculum for teaching about adaptive management.
Yes.
I think that specific definition didn't come from us.
All right. Well,
Anyway.
I won't ask you that because there's something else came up, and that was your own final report to the National Commission on Science and Sustainable Forestry. I think that's a U.S. report.
That's right.
May 15th, 2006. And it had your name on it as the lead author.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And it opened with these words, introductory words: adaptive management, AM, is a rigorous approach for learning through deliberately designing and applying management actions as experiments. It was first developed under the name Adaptive Environmental Assessment and Management in the 1970s by Dr. C.S. Halling and Dr. C.J. Walters and Associates at the University of British Columbia and International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna. Pausing there, is that the same Dr. Walters who gave evidence here in...
The very same.
Oh, yes. He seems to pop up everywhere.
He's a busy man.
So he's one of the leaders in the field of adaptive management.
Yes, he is.
Yes. And then your introductory paragraph continues, it has since been applied in a wide range of resource and ecosystem management problems throughout North America and elsewhere. AM is an approach to management that involves synthesizing existing knowledge, exploring alternative actions, making explicit predictions of their outcomes, selecting one or more actions to implement, monitoring to see if the actual outcomes match those predicted, and then using these results to learn and adjust future management plans and policies. And then you have a diagram with outlining the 6 steps, one of which is evaluate. And then it carries on in page 2. Adaptive management may be essential for achieving sustainable forestry. AM is enabled through consideration of the desire for fair and equitable treatment of tenure holders, other resource users, and communities, i.e. trying to ensure the costs and benefits of management experiments are borne equally, semicolon. Creative approaches to sharing the costs and benefits of AM, semicolon, and compensation programs to mitigate losses associated with decisions based on AM. It can help to compare the real costs and benefits of traditional management, including cost of litigation, versus the cost and benefits of an AM approach. Finally, there needs to be strong, explicit links between the result of management experiments and the use of those results to modify regulations and future practices, often referred to as closing the loop. So that basically defines the concept, does it?
Yes, I couldn't have said it better if I read it myself.
which I think you probably did.
At least partially.
Yeah, that's all right. So you mean by that, do you, that it's critical to the principle of adaptive management that first of all, a prospective cost-benefit analysis is done, and then a retrospective cost-benefit is done afterwards, following the management experiment in order to determine its results?
In the design stage, which is the second step in that diagram that's in that report, the key thing is to simulate through all of the following steps: the implementation of the actions, the monitoring of those actions, the evaluation, and the adjustment phase if you have different outcomes. And so part of that is looking at costs and benefits for different objectives, such as, in case of fisheries, conservation or harvest, ecosystem integrity, all of those trade-offs.
And that's done on a prospective basis, and then after the experiment it's done on a retrospective basis. Is that correct?
Well, I would say during the experiment you're trying to get feedback continually, so that you're learning as it goes, and then as it's completed, if it's a finite length experiment, then wrapping that up and saying, well, here's what the implications are for what actions we take subsequently.
Yes. And the point of assessing the implications is not to cast blame on the original decision makers, but to inform future decision making. Is that?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, many countries have applied the AM process to fisheries management decisions, I think. Is that right? Principally Australia and the US.
The number of successful applications is fairly small, but there have been a few.
Okay. And one other passage in the U.S. Forestry Report that I found useful is at page 51 of that report. It deals with how science is conducted. It says that adaptive management combines science and management in order to learn from management experience. To enable adaptive management, both science and management have to combine in a way that transforms both. In doing so, management becomes more scientifically rigorous, and research becomes more policy relevant. Without scientific rigor, initiatives billed as adaptive management may be little more than undisciplined trial and error, a poor paradigm for effective learning. So that brings in the role of science in the adaptive management approach. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that interaction is extremely important.
Yeah. Now, just so I fully understand it, in the forestry context, if you're dealing with something like a request to defer the cutting of trees in a certain watershed for, say, 20 years, you'd start off by doing a prospective analysis, bringing in the botanists to determine what the growth would be over that period of time. You'd bring in economists to do the cost side of the cost-benefit analysis. And then the results of that would go forward to the policy decision that you mentioned a moment ago. Is that how it would work?
Well, the description that you just gave could apply to a situation where there wasn't a lot of uncertainty. Adaptive management is only appropriate where there's a lot of uncertainty. So in the example you gave, for you to apply adaptive management, there would need to be some uncertainty about whether it was necessary, say, to protect a fish population in the stream near where the cutting was going to occur, whether it was necessary to defer that harvesting or not. Otherwise, you wouldn't be applying adaptive management. You might apply some other methods.
Well, you might have uncertainties coming in through global warming changes and that sort of thing. Would you not?
Actually, global warming is an example I often use where you can't apply adaptive management because, first of all, there's no possibility of replication. There's only one planet, and it's going to take 50 or 60 years.
We have two matters that are outstanding from today. One of them is a document that was marked for identification, and I'm wondering if we need to put some more structure around how we're going to deal with that because we have such limited time. Looking at how that document was treated, it wouldn't be going in for the truth of the document. It goes in simply as a foundation to questions that were asked, and it's really the evidence that came from Mr. Marmurick, which is the evidence that is relevant and can have some weight attached to it. Given that it was, although Mr. Harvey didn't directly put it to him when he was answering his questions, it was clear that it was the document that was being referenced in the answers. I would suggest that that should be marked as a full exhibit, and given how close we are to the end of hearings, I'm concerned about adding more time to the process and moving that forward. I know that you had indicated there may be other parties that would like to comment on that, but again, at the risk of being extremely irritating, I would say that those parties who haven't shown up to the hearings, I'm not sure that we should be waiting on the process for them to weigh in on that issue. They are not here to weigh in on any other marking of exhibits when they're not in the room. So I would suggest we deal with that one first today. That would be my first point, which we could deal with, and then I have one other point.
Mr. Commissioner, I spoke to my client about this at the coffee break this morning and said that this issue would be coming up and I need to get instructions. I do not have any instructions with respect to that document, so I'm not in a position to take a position right now.
Which document are we speaking?
This was an email from Carl Walters to Mr. Marmer.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think what we could do, Ms. Baker, is Mr. Lunn will be sending out his usual reminder about the hearing on Thursday. And I would suggest that he could include in that notice mention of this document and the fact that, for one thing, Mr. Timber does not have instructions at this point, but that we will deal with it on Thursday pending any matter or any submission that a party wishes to make with respect to the document. And so we could cover it off in his notice to make sure people know that we're going to deal with it on Thursday.
Thank you. And then the last point is the document which was talked to, which Mr. Isaac talked to you about, which is the document which we say is privileged. And I have some concerns about how we proceed with this document. At the moment, it is a document. It hasn't been put to any witness. The author of the document has not been called. I cannot imagine what evidentiary weight could attach to this. It's not going to be able to be used for the truth of the document. It really has no evidentiary value at all, and I'm wondering if we really need to go through the process of submissions on the weight to be given to this document, its admissibility and everything else, given our very limited time and given the fact that I don't see in my submission how any weight can attach to this document in any event.
Ms. Baker, I don't think I disagree with your position on the privilege matter that you've raised with respect to its admissibility. I think, in fairness to Mr. Eidsvik, I can recall him suggesting that he had some position to take on the matter of privilege. He hasn't expressed that position to me, and nor I have not seen any submission in writing from him. So at this point in time, I don't think there's any need for me to deal with it. If Mr. Eidsvik wishes to raise the matter with some position or submission that I ought to address, then I will address it. But at the moment, I don't intend to deal with it until he takes some action with regard to expressing a submission or position on whether or not it ought to be admitted. I understand your position. He seems to suggest, at least he did today, that there was some answer to that position, but he hasn't expressed it. So at this point in time, it's not going to be marked, but I'm content that if he wants to raise it again, I'll see what he has to say.
Thank you. And then the last one hopefully won't irritate you, which is simply about Thursday morning. There's apparently a fire drill in the building that day, and we can't start until, I think, 10:45. People are going to be hopefully able to be back in the room with a hopeful start time of 11, I think is the message I'm supposed to communicate to the room.
Yes, I think I was forewarned about the fire drill. I'm not sure why it takes an hour, but apparently it does. It's the federal government. They take longer than the provincial government to organize fire drills. So I understand we're starting at 11, I believe, on Thursday morning, and we may sit a bit later that day to try to make up for lost time. I think that's Mr. Wallace's intention. Mr. Rosenblum seems to know something to tell me.
No, I don't know anything. In fact, this is the first I've heard of it. Why don't we start early that morning and then take our coffee break during this 1 hour fire drill?
I don't know the details, except I know that they'd been negotiating extensively with the building on this, and this was where they landed.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I just wanted to know, is for Mr. Lunn's benefit, will his notice with respect to the exhibit refer to written submissions or oral submissions?
I would prefer written submissions by Thursday then, Mr. Harvey, if anybody has one they wish to submit. We'll have, I think, a full day on Thursday without this matter. So we'll leave it at council coming at 10:45 on Thursday morning so we can get underway as close to 11 as possible. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Hearing is now adjourned until Thursday at 11 a.m.
Chain scientists, and also an economist to do the arithmetic.
That sounds reasonable.
All right. When you first learned of the topics chosen by David Levy for the science reports of this commission, did you have a discussion about the nature of those science reports with him by any chance?
They were basically, we were informed of what those topics were, but we didn't discuss whether there was anything missing, for example. It seemed pretty comprehensive to me.
All right. Are you aware by any chance that Dr. Walters made a request to Dr. Levy for a retrospective analysis?
Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure that this is relevant for the witness to talk about discussions that happened internally at the commission between other scientists. I would object to this line of questioning.
Well, the problem is that
I wasn't aware,
you, all right,
so
all right, I'll leave it at that.
makes it a short discussion.
All right, well, let me turn to your report. Your object, if I understand it right, was to determine the possible and likely causal mechanisms for the 20-year decline, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you show that on page 29 of your report, which shows the dropping productivity, dropping actually below a dashed line, representing the level at which the population can replace itself.
That's correct.
That's a very serious situation.
Yes, it
obviously.
is.
Yes. You examined 5 life history stages, concluded that coastal marine conditions and climate change were the primary likely causes.
That's correct.
I couldn't help noticing in your report that the stage, I think it's the second stage, which deals with the fry in the rearing lakes.
Actually, that's the first stage. The second stage is smolts from the lake down to the estuary.
But the first stage ends with the fall fry, as far as I could make out. It doesn't include overwintering, and it doesn't include the period in the spring when you've got 2-year classes occupying the same lake.
Well, it does. There's 2 different things here. One is that the way we define the stage, it's up to the point where the smolts leave the lakes. However, in the monitoring that's gone on to date, there are only 9 of the 19 monitored stocks, which is only 19 out of 36 conservation units, but there's only 9 that have any sort of juvenile monitoring, and 7 of those only monitor up to the fall fry, as you've said, and then there's Chilco and Cultus that have the smolt monitoring.
Which stage does overwintering and the short period in the spring before the migration starts, which stage does that fall in?
So that would fall into what we call stage 1, even though we don't have data on that stage for all but 2 of the stocks, really.
You conclude that there's no decline in that stage, but you haven't been able to assess mortality over the winter or in the spring during the migration. Is that correct?
That's true, and that's a data gap that we point out should be rectified. So if there were impacts that were happening over the winter, they would not show up in 7 of those 9 juvenile monitoring programs.
With respect to your conclusion about coastal marine conditions and climate change, you'd agree that those are matters that fishery managers can do little or nothing about, I expect.
Actually, I don't agree with that. If you look at the paper that was submitted by Kim Hyatt, I'm not sure who submitted it, but it's one of the 62 documents I got last week. The fisheries management of the Barkley Sound stocks have relied on monitoring of salinity and temperature conditions as those smolts are going out to sea, and then use that to modify expectations of the amount of harvest 2 years later. So if it's generally warmer waters and an El Nino influence, they tend to get like 1% to 2% marine survival, and if it's fairly cool waters, they tend to have like 6 or 7% marine survival. So it's an expectations management thing, which is valuable, I think,
yes,
for harvest managers.
Yes, of course, but
you can't change the ocean.
Yeah, and if a decline is caused by that, they can't reverse the decline because they can't change the ocean.
That's correct.
Would you agree with this, that if the coastal marine conditions are more challenging nowadays for Fraser River sockeye, it is very important that the smolts entering the estuary are as well nourished as possible and as strong in terms of size, state of health, and energy levels?
I think that's one of the things that's important. I think what's also really important, as was shown in one of the papers by Dick Beamish and co-authors, is that you need a wide diversity of life history types. So for example, the Harrison sockeye that apparently are still doing well, and the South Thompson coho that are still doing reasonably well. I think it was South Thompson coho. Chinook, thanks. Have a later entry time into the Strait of Georgia. So I think when you have these highly variable marine conditions, both from year to year and spatially, it's extremely important to have a wide diversity of life history types.
Yes. All right. You accept, I think, the basic premises behind the Ricker model, namely that the productive capacity of the freshwater ecosystem limits the number of smolts that can be produced in any particular watershed?
Yes, I think the way you said it in words is correct. The Ricker model isn't always the best fit for every population.
And after a certain egg and fry abundance, the Ricker model assumes a limit that is graphically noted as the dome of the Ricker curve.
That's correct.
Yes. And that is the point at which something begins to operate to prevent a further increase. And it's that something that is responsible for killing off sockeye at a rate greater than the rate of increase of fry, of eggs.
Yeah, there's a point at which competitive effects of one form or another, either for space or for food, or other effects like disease, can come to occur if the density is too high.
Starvation, pathogens, and predators have all been suggested, and there's some debate about the relative contribution of each, I think. But there's no doubt about the consequence, namely a die-off greater than the rate of increase after the dome of the Ricker curve. Is that basically correct?
That's correct, although as noted in the paper that I think you submitted from Clark et al. For Alaska sockeye, that's not a sustainable problem, because when you have lower production, you then flip over to the other side of the curve.
Yes.
Lower numbers of spawners.
This shows the basic Ricker stock recruitment curve.
That's correct.
S max is there at the top of the curve, shows the maximum possible biomass for a given watershed on this model. Is that correct?
For given stock, I suspect, yes.
Yeah. SEQ.
That's the point at which you have one-to-one.
Yes, one-to-one replacement, and below that, this is equivalent to the dotted line in your graph. The population is not replacing itself after you pass that point.
That's correct.
All right. And SMSY on the left-hand side of the curve contains the two biological reference points, the escapement benchmarks, marked with the arrows, I think. Is that as you understand it?
That seems to be correct.
Yes. And according to the Alaskan definition, beyond the SMSY point, they refer to as over-escapement. Now, if you turn to page 5, if we would turn to that, Mr. Lund, please. I think this gets to the passage you're referring to. First of all, at the top of this page, any generic theory of salmon production must include the two main ecological processes of an intrinsic rate of increase and a carrying capacity. Similar information can be found in basic texts on fisheries, and Rickers referred to Hilborn and Walters, etc. Then dropping down to the fourth paragraph, the intrinsic rate of increase causes a salmon stock to grow indefinitely, but there must be a limit to this growth. The carrying capacity describes the density-dependent survival of a salmon stock, where the survival of the stock is directly related to the size of the escapement. And finally, at the beginning of the next paragraph, the carrying capacity of a salmon stock is thought to be watershed and stock specific. That's the sort of general elementary principle of salmon production. Is that correct?
Yes.
If you turn to page 19, I'm sorry, this gets to the point you referred to, page 19. towards the bottom, the paragraph beginning, this result is consistent. I'm sorry, this result, I should refer just to the previous sentence. Although some stocks exhibited increases in yield, when averaged across these 29 stocks, over-escapement resulted in a decrease in yields and an increase in the variability of risk. This result is consistent with the generic theory of compensatory production, where spawning efficiency decreases with increasing escapement levels, and stocks are limited by the carrying capacity of the habitat. Over-escapement in general is not sustainable, as it causes returns and yields to decrease in the next generation, which also result in lower escapements. Lower escapements then result in higher returns and yields in succeeding generations. That's what you referred to a moment ago, is that correct?
Yes, that's what I referred to a moment ago now. And a really important caveat here is that all assumes that the stock recruitment curve remains the same over time.
Yes.
So if you have a major change in ocean conditions, for example, that curve might decrease.
Yes. But also, does it not assume this? Fisheries managers do not cut off all harvest in the succeeding generations and thereby repeat the over-escapement, because you can repeat over-escapement in succeeding generations, of course, simply by cutting off harvest.
Yes, you can. I think it's important in this paper also to read the following paragraph too. For the remaining 11 stocks where observed exploitation rate is greater than exploitation rate at maximum sustainable yield, we found that yields tended to increase as escapements increased, even when over-escapement occurred. And I believe out of the 40 Alaskan stocks they looked at, they only found evidence of delayed density dependence in 5 of them.
Yes.
So I think you have to put it in that larger context.
But delayed density dependence is the Larkin model. we're talking here about the Ricker model, are we not?
That's correct. I'm just referring to the conclusions of the study at the beginning of the abstract. So I just think you need to. It's easy to zoom in on particular cases where this happened, but it's also important to look at the proportion of cases where it happened.
Yes. There's something similar to this produced by Kim Hyatt at our document number 5, Mr. Lund. I don't think it's an exhibit yet. This is Hyatt, Rankin, Sue Grant, and others, including Steve Cox, I see, Cox Rogers.
Yes, that's actually the document I meant earlier.
Oh, I see. All right, this document at page 19 of 22 has a model. This is a general conceptual model summarizing biophysical mechanism interactions, etc. If we start at the bottom left-hand corner where it says escapement increases, the arrows bring us to the right. Stock fry recruitment increases. Then it goes up, slower fry growth and smaller smolts. And then it goes up and they enter the marine ecosystem. And on the right are certain conditions in the marine, and on the left are certain other conditions. If we go up the right, this is the challenging marine conditions. The next one is early growth of juvenile salmon is slow. Then it goes to the right, mortality above average for juvenile salmon. Then it goes down, adult returns below the average. And then if we take the arrow down from the right, escapement decreases, stock fry recruitment decreases, and then we get faster fry growth and larger smolts. That's the concept you're referring to as over-escapement being not sustainable. Is that correct?
That's right.
But would you agree that if, on the bottom, where the bottom right says escapement decreases, if that were adjusted by fishery managers so that we have over-escapement again, we'd be back on the left-hand side where it says escapement increases, and we'd be going up the same cycle again, would we not?
Well, on the left-hand side of the diagram in this paper, he's contrasting state 1, which is La Nina-like conditions, which are more favorable ocean conditions. So the reason for higher escapement on the left-hand side is related to better marine conditions, and the reason for lower escapement on the right-hand side is either poor marine conditions or this oscillating fact that you're sort of flipping back and forth between the peak of that curve that we talked about.
Yes, well, no, I'm not disputing that marine conditions can be more challenging at times and less challenging at other times. But that, as you said a moment ago, is something we can't do much about, correct?
Well, as I also said a moment ago, I think you can adjust your habitat and harvest and even hatchery management actions to account for what kind of ocean regime you're in.
Yes. And you did say, I think you agreed, that you'd want to produce the largest and strongest smolts into a challenging marine environment, obviously.
To the degree that you can.
Yes. I was struck by something in a document that Mr. Timberg read to you yesterday, and I wonder if we could bring that up again. Exhibit 1903, Mr. Lunn. I'm looking for a passage beginning the NPC.
That's at the top right.
Oh, top right. NPCC noted that. Ah, yes, top right. The NPCC noted that while we cannot control the ocean, we can monitor ocean conditions and related salmon survival and take actions to improve the likelihood that Columbia River Basin salmon can survive varying ocean conditions. A better understanding of the ocean conditions that influence the salmon survival should provide insight as to which management actions taken inland will provide the greatest restoration benefit. And then the next paragraph says, the recruitment success in the ocean environment is generally believed to occur largely during the first critical months at sea, and Ricker is cited for that. Now, there are two interesting points there, I think. First of all, that fishery managers should focus on what they can control in order to meet the challenges of what they cannot control. I expect you to agree with that, would you?
Yes.
And secondly, that Ricker appears to have recognized that the salmon die-off that occurs at spawner abundance levels beyond the dome of the Ricker curve are experienced largely during the first critical months in the marine environment. I wonder if you have any reason to disagree with that.
I think that's in general true, although as this paper outlines, Petrosky and Shaller's paper outlines, where you have a lot of dams in the Columbia River, you can also have quite a lot of mortality before you get to the estuary.
But I think it also discusses the delayed effect of that experience, the migration experience, does it not?
That's what that paper discusses,
So
yes.
in other words, the mortality often occurs in the early marine stage.
That's correct. There's a considerable amount of debate which has gone over at least a couple of decades as to the proportion of that delayed mortality that is actually delayed mortality because of the dams that fish go through versus simply changes in ocean conditions or some combination thereof.
Yes. Let's put it this way. Ricker in 1975, in that paper that's noted, 1976, was not talking about dams. He was just talking about the
That's right.
general conceptual model. Yes. In other words, the effects of excessive escapement, as the effects causing mortality in the first critical months in the ocean.
I think it's been a while since I looked at that Ricker 1976 paper, but I believe what he was talking about is that the conditions that fish experience when they first get to sea are very important to determine the level of survival. So it's a combination of how much density-dependent effects occurred from the amount of spawning that was happening in the spawning ground as well as the conditions that they encountered. The two interact together cumulatively.
Yes. But the Ricker curve is based solely on what happens in the freshwater, in the spawner abundance levels in freshwater.
Right. But what you have to recognize is that there's really a family of Ricker curves for any given population. So when the ocean conditions get worse, you have a much lower curve. When the ocean conditions get better, you have a higher curve.
When the ocean conditions are worse, you get a more severe curve, a sharper dome. Is that correct?
No, it's just the whole thing drops.
The whole thing drops. Oh, I see. All right. Now, am I correct that the Ricker model was further developed by Larkin, in that Larkin found or hypothesized from stock recruitment data that the effects of excessive spawner abundance crossed cycle lines, so that not only one generation was affected, as Ricker found, but one or more successive cycles could also be affected.
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, the Larkin model is not accepted by everyone as being applicable to Fraser stocks, but everyone who knows anything about fish population dynamics accepts the basic Ricker model. Would that be a fair comment?
I don't know about anyone, but let's say those are the two most commonly used models.
Now, I've referred you to the Alaskan paper, and what I'm going to suggest with respect to your conclusions, I'm going to suggest to you that what we saw in the Kim Hyatt paper, and we discussed a moment ago about overescapement not being sustainable. It can be sustainable if overescapement is repeated by harvest adjustment actions. And I'm going to suggest to you that that's basically what's happened over the course of the years that followed the 1987 building plan, namely exploitation rates were cut back increasingly in successive cycles to such an extent that it took until about 2006 for escapement levels to decrease to the left-hand side of the Ricker curve. That's where I'm coming from. And I'm going to further suggest that added to the Ricker density dependence effects are the delayed density dependence effects consistent with the Larkin model in most major runs. Now, you're aware, no doubt, that Dr. Peterman found that the Larkin model fit almost perfectly with the Quesnel run.
So what Dr. Peterman and Dorner found is that the Quesnel stock was the only one of the 19 Fraser stocks for which there was consistent evidence of delayed density dependence.
Yes.
And went through, I believe, 3 different sets of indicators by which they evaluated the likelihood of delayed density dependence.
Yes. Now, you consulted Dr. Walters on that, I think, by email, and I'd just like to add to the record the final email that he sent you back last week.
So can I just clarify something on that?
Yes.
So what I did in preparing for this week is the previous lawyer talked a lot about the workshop that we had November 29th and 30th, and in that document at that time Dr. Peterman said, well, Carl Walters seems to be coming around to the belief that the Quesnel stock is really the only one for which there's any evidence of delayed density dependence. And so I was rereading that and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if Carl still thinks that way. Yeah. So I sent him an email, and he sent me back an email, actually more than one. And my response to that is that what we have, if you go back, rewind to the June 2010 PSC workshop where Carl Walters presented his hypothesis that there was delayed density dependence in several stocks and had a 5-page handout. So that was a 5-page handout, not very detailed on methods. And then Dr. Peterman and Dorner went through their very detailed analysis. And in the correspondence I had with Dr. Walters, and also in the handout that he done, it's clear that there's several things which differ between what he's doing and what Randall Peterman and Bridget Dorner did. So, first of all, Dr. Walters is using a different method of fitting the curves. At least he did before, in that he had not allowing positive coefficients on those Larkin parameters. Secondly, he had a different way of weighting the weak years. Thirdly, they may be using somewhat different data sets, because I know that Drs. Peterman and Dorner fixed up some problems with the data sets since the PSC workshop. And fourthly, they're using somewhat different ways of deciding on whether delayed density dependence is happening or not. So they're both excellent fishery scientists, but what we have here is one very detailed report by Peterman and Dorner describing all their methods. On the other hand, we have an email with a graph in it. So I think that if you're going to have an apples-to-apples comparison, what you really need is a very detailed description of exactly the methods that Dr. Walters used, because I found in many previous cases that unless you know exactly what data and methods are used, it's very hard to compare the conclusions. And one more thing I just mentioned is that Dr. Peterman used the Kalman filter approach and said that it was unbiased, and Dr. Walters in his email said, well, the Kalman filter approach is biased. So all of this needs to be worked through in a collegial way, probably with a few other independent scientists, to examine the data and the methods and the process by which the conclusions are done.
In order to determine who is right, Dr. Peterman or Dr. Walters, would that be the object?
Well, yeah, or the relative degree of rightness.
Yeah, all right. Good. I'd like to mark, if we could, oh, I'm sorry, I don't think we marked the previous exhibit.
That was tab 5, Mr. Harvey.
Yes.
You wish that marked to be
Yes,
marked
please.
as 1907.
I'm sorry, what is that, Mr. Oster?
That's
It's tab 5 on this list.
That's the Hyatt paper,
Oh,
Hyatt et al.,
Thank you.
entitled ENSO-Induced Harmonic Oscillations. That's, what number did you say that was?
1907.
1907. And the Carl Walters one at tab 15, could that be marked as 1908?
Mr. Commissioner, it's Brenda Gartner for the First Nations Coalition. I am objecting to this being marked as an exhibit. As the witness has already very clearly said, we have no clear indication of the source of the materials that Carl Walters, it's not the email so much as the attachments to the emails, which are a series of graphs and materials. We have no clear indication of the source or the methods that Dr. Walters has used. This has neither been peer-reviewed, which has been the test for getting in documents like this from scientists, nor is it the subject of evidence. Dr. Walters is not here and cannot be here to be cross-examined on this. And so in my view, it hasn't met any test, neither the scientific test nor the legal test, and should not be admitted.
Mr. Commissioner, Keith Lowes, I'm supporting marking the document. As I understand the way that the questions went, the document isn't tendered as an expert opinion. It's tendered to show the existence of a controversy between two competent scientists, and goes no further than that. My friend's objections in that sense, with respect to qualifications, I submit are unfounded, or at least they don't go to the purpose that the document is tendered for.
Well, once again, I think the appropriate manner, Mr. Harvey, is to mark it for identification purposes for this, perhaps this main reason, that it cuts across a number of topics that have been addressed at this commission. Not all council are here this morning that were privy to that set of hearings where they did take positions on many of the topics you've raised here this morning. I think it would be prudent to mark it for identification purposes and allow other council to weigh in on whether or not they feel it ought to be marked for as an exhibit. So I think we'll give it a sign of an identification number at this point.
Yes, and I gather then council will be invited to submit written.
Yes, as they have with other exhibits.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, of course, that process is out now to you for decision, so
right.
We will need to move any objections or comments on this document along very quickly. I would suggest we need to probably have it by Thursday completed, because we're going back into hearings again on Thursday, and then we're done.
Well, I'll just leave it at this point as marking it for the next letter for identification, Mr. Giles.
That'll be marked as G, 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 triple G.
Thank you. And Mr. Harvey, I believe your time
I'm
is
sorry.
now over.
H. It should be I. I'm sorry.
So I should say I've done some negotiating with my time, and I understand that Mr. Rosenblum has agreed, and I also had discussions with Mr. Eisvik, Mr. Lowe's. I also had discussions with Mr. Leadham, but he didn't leave me any time. But I think I can say that we will finish, certainly, in time to allow all the remaining people that follow Mr. Lowe's the allotted time. And I'm grateful to my friends if I could just carry on. Mr. Marmarek, I'm right, I think, that you didn't have the benefit of Dr. Walters in the workshop you conducted in the fall of 2010?
That's correct, he wasn't there.
What about Mike LaPointe, Jim Woody, and Jeremy Hume? Were they there?
Mike LaPointe was there,
Mike LaPointe.
I believe. You can check on the participant list.
All right. Jim Woody?
No, Jim Woody and Jeremy Hume were not there.
The PSC workshop records a diversity of views ranging from unlikely to likely for density or delayed density dependent effects as the cause of the 20-year decline. I think that's right, isn't it?
That's from likely to unlikely for the overall declines and very unlikely for the 2009
Yes.
poor returns.
Yes. But there's no indication there that I could see whether those who know most about the subject of population dynamics fell on the likely side or the unlikely side. You haven't done any qualitative separation or analysis, is that right? You know,
I guess what I would say is I don't think it makes a lot of sense to analyze in detail what was a fairly short effort by a panel of scientists after that PSC workshop, during and after that PSC workshop. I don't think you can compare that effort, which probably amounted to, a week or two of time, with the effort that was done by Drs. Peterman and Dorner over several months, over many stocks, to look at things in a lot of detail. Nor do I think you can compare an email that you just discussed with the effort by Drs. Peterman and Dorner. So I think you need to apply some level of weight to these different types of evidence, and I would put, as we did in our technical report, a lot more weight on the very thorough analysis by Peterman and Dorner in their technical report 10.
Dr. Riddell gave evidence here that on this subject, and he said, with respect to the delayed density discussion, many people were really encountering that discussion for the first time, and so you have a fairly wide range of whether or not it was contributing to the long-term decline. Now, well, I think I'll leave it at that. The difference of opinion on delayed density dependence was one thing, but I think you've said on density dependence, no one is challenging the Ricker model.
Well, as you've already described, sometimes the Larkin model fits better than the Ricker model, but I don't think there's any doubt that density dependence occurs, and in the analyses that we did, I described briefly yesterday, there's density dependence for all the stocks. That's correct.
Yeah. Would it have assisted you in your search for a causal mechanism if an adaptive management process had been followed by DFO with respect to the 87 rebuilding plan, both prospectively and retrospectively?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm only familiar in general with that rebuilding plan, not specifically with the details, but I guess what I would say is for any hypothesis you're trying to analyze, the more contrast you have in your treatments over space or stocks or time, the better.
Yes. There's a note, if we could just turn to it for a moment, at Exhibit 73. It says, clearly though, it is not sufficient to merely describe changes in indicators of productivity of Fraser sockeye salmon and attempt to attribute those changes to cause by merely describing plausible sounding hypothesized mechanisms. As noted in this report's introduction, statistical analysis of data gathered from carefully designed manipulative experiments is the best way to understand causal mechanisms in ecological systems. But in the case of Fraser River sockeye, such experiments are not practical, except perhaps with changing spawner abundance through altered harvest rates. That would seem to refer to what was done following the 87 rebuilding plan. Does it not?
I think it was, Ronald Peterman wrote this paragraph. I think this was just in general that with respect to the stressors that we were looking at, some are more amenable to manipulation than others.
Yeah.
Now, I think it'd be fair to say, because I know something about Dr. Peterman's work on this area, that were you to explore what you're proposing of changing harvest rates, you would want to do a very careful analysis, as you talked about earlier, an adaptive management approach of what all the uncertainties are, both with respect to stock recruitment relationships, potential marine survival rates, ability to meet target harvest rates, which is sometimes difficult, implications for implications for co-migrating weaker stocks, implications for the wild salmon policy. So there's a host of trade-offs you'd need to examine if you were to explore designing a manipulative experiment to alter harvest rates.
Yes, and included in the trade-offs, as you said earlier, is the cost to the economy.
Yes.
To the economy. All right. Now, with respect to your goal of determining the likely mechanism, you went through 4 different criterion that you said you'd want to satisfy: plausible mechanism, exposure, correlation, and corroborating evidence. Heard something about that. That's your basic structure.
That's correct.
Yes. Would you also wish to add that the hypothesized causal mechanism should account for both the 2009 disaster and the 2010 bonanza?
Our terms of reference were to look primarily at the long-term decline and the poor returns in 2009. That's when we started.
Yes.
And then the 2010 returns provided some very interesting contrast. So it's very helpful information.
And also the drop in the early 60s following the 1958, the large 1958 run in the Adams and the large escapement in 1958. Your model, your hypothesized causal mechanism should take that into account too, should it not?
So the analyses that we did focused primarily on trends since 1980, which you showed in that earlier graph. We didn't go back to 1958. And the statistical analyses that we did, the earliest we went back was 1969.
I see.
Now the work that Peterman and Dorner did, I believe, go back all the way to the early 50s, because the time series they were working with goes back that far.
I'd like to refer you to Exhibit 184 on this basic subject of correlations. At page 12, there are graphs. The bottom line shows the result of the adaptive, what I've called the 1987 rebuilding program, the escapement being a run-up. And it also shows in the top graph the productivity. Now, that shows in basic, very general terms, a covariation or correlation, does it not? I guess you call it a negative correlation. Escapement increasing and productivity dropping.
It does. However, you have to be very careful in looking at graphs like this, to put them in a larger context, and if I could reply with page 33 from our document. That's document page, not PDF.
Right, thank you.
So this is the column and filter estimates of productivity from Peterman and Dorner's report. So the reason, I'm sorry, it's one more page. Sorry, next page, pardon me. So here we have a bunch of stocks that are not in the Fraser River, that were not experiencing the rebuilding experiment, yet also show declining productivity. So I think that's why it's very important to look at a contrasting set of conditions to try to understand causes. And that's essentially what Peterman and Dorner did in their report. So when you look at that graph you just had up earlier, yes, it shows that as spawners go up following that one rebuilding experiment, recruits per spawner go down. But there's also many things going on in many other stocks where productivity, recruits per spawner, is also dropping, and yet there was not rebuilding going on. So I think you have to think about this in a broader context.
Well, there were other things happening. For example, after the Exxon Valdez, there was a few years of no harvesting in that area, increasing escapements and a subsequent decline in productivity. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am, from that report we discussed earlier.
All right. And the Columbia and the Bristol Bay show a different sequence, different productivity trend.
That's right.
If you were to try to do something like this chart here, and instead of the bottom line being effective total spawners, it were environmental changes, you could never draw a line that would correlate with the top line of productivity, could you? You could never.
I'm not sure what you're saying. You're saying there's no environmental parameter that would follow that same curve, and therefore this is the most likely explanation for the decline? Is that where you're going with this? Because I don't agree with that.
No, I never mind where I'm going. The question is, you couldn't take your hypothesis of marine conditions and produce a line like the bottom line of this chart.
Actually, I think you could, and you could look in the report from Dr. McKinnell. If we want to go to it, let's flip to page 136 in the document.
Exhibit 1291.
So this isn't an exactly perfect figure, but it's one interesting example. That's the Word document, not the PDF number. Sorry, it's going to be further ahead. Page 136. Yeah, another 10 pages and you're there. So this is this graph here at figure 95. So this is Dave Mackis's index of conditions off the coastal waters off Vancouver Island. So it doesn't exactly apply because it's not Georgia Strait and Queen Charlotte Sound. But you can also see that there is warmer and unproductive period that starts in about 1991, 1992. And then there's a period around 99 through 2002 where things get better, but then they largely get worse again. So, there are many variables environmental variables, which could show let's say, increasing level of stress in addition to the one that you just raised, namely increased spawners and therefore increased density dependence. So I think it comes back to what question we're trying to answer here, and the question we're trying to answer is, what are the primary causes for the overall changes in Fraser River sockeye productivity over the last 20 years? And our conclusion was that with the exception of the Quesnel stock, delayed density dependence was unlikely to be a major factor.
Yes. Well, let me just ask you this. At page 138 of your report,
Yeah.
there's there's a reference to a lack of persistent environmental recruitment correlations. Page
Oh,
one-
is this
somewhere at page
Sean Cox's review?
138 of your report. And it doesn't seem to be disputed by anyone else there. The linear correlative approach taken by this report has failed to explain much in the way of salmon population dynamics, despite decades of work. In fact, prominent scientists have doubted our ability to link recruitment to environmental factors for more than 2 decades, etc.
Yes, and that's correct. And so it is difficult to, well, I think Niels Bohr, the physicist, once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And so it's easier to go back, because there's only one past, and try to explain what factors were likely responsible than it is to be able to go forward and make projections based on past correlations, which may not be sustained in the future.
Well, you were doing a retrospective.
That's correct.
And somewhere on this page, and I'm sorry, I realize my marked up copy of a report I left behind, is the statement that there's a lack of persistence of environmental recruitment correlations. I wonder if you agree with that.
I think that's what the evidence shows, that people find certain correlations and then try to apply them in the future, and they don't work so well.
Okay. On the question of correlations, you accept, I think, that the Columbia, I note that you've done some work there as well, it experienced record returns of sockeye in 2008, 2009.
Yes, particularly the Okanagan sockeye, yeah.
And that's an area where the spawner biomass in that system, the Okanagan system, was well below the carrying capacity of the rearing lakes.
I'm not so sure about that. I guess, prior to that return. I mean, Osoyoos Lake is a pretty tough place for a sockeye smolt. You have a temperature oxygen squeeze, very high temperatures in the top, very low oxygen down below. So when you talk about the rearing capacity there's not a lot of volume for smolts. And so, I'd have to go back to Kim Hyatt and the origin of that stock going back to, I guess it would be the 2005 brood year. And I guess it would be 2000, it would have been rearing in 2007 to try to rearing in 2006 in Osoyoos Lake to try to understand whether or not, what the densities were like. That's a pretty detailed question.
All right. All right. At any rate, you agree that the trend line for the Columbia is far different than the trend line set out at page 29 of your report for the Fraser.
Fortunately for the Okanagan stock, they appear to have gone around the west coast of Vancouver Island and encountered much better environmental conditions than the Fraser stocks that went up through Georgia Strait and Queen Charlotte Sound.
But Mr. Marmorek, a moment ago you showed us that the Barkley Sound stocks, which are the west coast of Vancouver Island, had the drop that other Canadian stocks do.
That's correct. So,
all right.
Nature giveth and nature taketh away.
All right. I'm sorry.
On that note, Mr. Harvey, it might be a good time to take a break.
Yes.
Hearing will now recess for 20 minutes.
No.